All right, so thanks a lot. This was, humbling presentation to follow. So just a little bit about me. My name's Laure. I'm a technical specialist on the wildlife trade team at Flora and Fauna International, the international conservation NGO. And previously, I trained as a social scientist, and I carried out a PhD on the implication of digital technologies for the management and protection of conservation sites. So that's a topic that's really dear to my heart, as it were, and it's really exciting to be part of this panel and this discussion. So what I want to do is highlight some tools and procedures that are already in use in international NGOs and that are of direct relevance to applying the responsible use of tech principles that Doug mentioned in his talk at the very beginning, and avoiding some of the, well, hopefully preventing some of the really damaging implications that Trishant's just described. So what this is inspired by is some work by myself and my colleague Sarah Gluszek. We've taken direct inspiration from the existing literature and debates and the papers that Doug mentioned in the introduction to create a synthetic version of this for advice to our colleagues in FFI who might be using technology against the illegal harvest and trade of wildlife. So, for example, using technology to monitor, investigate, and deter illegal activities such as poaching, but not limited to it. And what we've tried to do is links to familiar and existing resources that could guide applications. So I'm going to give some examples of this just now, focusing on law enforcement oriented users, because I know Koustubh's going to share his experience of sensitization and thinking through these issues for biodiversity monitoring just afterwards. So the first principle that I wanted to touch on was deploying technology based on necessity and proportionality. And just one thing that we've highlighted for our colleagues is the importance of being clear on the purpose of technology deployment and maintain a clear distinction between biomonitoring and law enforcement, because the practical ways of implementing responsible use principles will differ depending on the aims, but also Trishant's just shown the really damaging difficulties that can arise when there's unclarity around the exact uses and aims of the technology. So is the technology you're thinking about, be it a drone, a camera trap, network sensors, is it the right option? And these are questions that will generally be asked at this stage of developing a theory of change for conservation project proposals or statement of need. So these are things that are being done anyway, and it's just adding a layer of questioning and of consideration around tech. And if it is for law enforcement, advising on or supporting law enforcement by relevant authorities, can the technology actually deliver the stated aims? If it's about informing prosecution, can your camera trap take pictures of suspects that can be used in these contexts and that are clear enough for that? If it is about informing the deployment of staff, can rangers or local conservation staff receive the alerts and actually respond to them? And if it's to deter illegal activities, will it, is there a risk that it will create displacement to a nearby area or similar activities? The second principle that is in Doug's and Trishant's and colleagues' papers that I wanted to talk about a bit more is evaluating the impact on people in advance, and that can be done through a process that is sometimes used on projects very often used on projects in NGOs is social impact assessment of the positive and negative social and economic impacts that a conservation project will have. And very often, depending on the size of the NGO, there'll actually be members of staff that are specialists of asking these questions and using different methodologies to answer them. And I have to point out here as well that depending on the donor, it will also be a requirement. And to have a better understanding and awareness of what the likely impacts will be, it's also really important to keep up to date of emerging debates and research, and that's what we're doing just now. So, and you know, it's a first step on doing these evaluations ahead of time. And you know, if you're coming from the position of an NGO supporting or advising on the use of tech for law enforcement, it's important to understand ahead of time if technology will actually collect information about marginalized groups disproportionately, if it will collect information about groups that are actually not involved in the main illegal activities that are of interest and concern, but also if the deployment of tech will exacerbate social and political conflict, because none of these things in the end will contribute to protecting wildlife, and it might even be counterproductive, even when talking about law enforcement. The third principle that I wanted to touch on was building transparency and accountability, as well as disclosure into the use of tech. And that's important as well when it comes to law enforcement activities. It might not processes that are the gold standard for engaging with local residents and gathering content, such as FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent processes, might not be appropriate or relevant when it comes to law enforcement, but it's still valid, valuable, and important to inform residents of the deployment and purposes of surveillance devices that might be in the landscape, as well as where they can reach out to for grievances and complaints if they have any. And you know, that engaging and informing residents about the results that have been obtained is still possible, even when it's for law enforcement purposes. Last but not least, protecting data in order to safeguard privacy. Trishant's just touched during the question part on the legal obligations that are associated with handling and sharing data on potential illegal activities that might be detected. It's either intentionally or by accident. And I think it's really important to have an awareness of these legal obligations before deploying technology, but also assessing carefully whether it's possible and desirable to share these types of information with government bodies, depending on their practices and the way they operate. So that's for consideration beforehand. But of course, during and after, a data management plan is something that every person doing a survey or handling digital data will have. So it could be a case of just adding a layer of consideration into privacy law and good sensitive practice for handling images of people, such as we've talked a bit about deleting images or filtering them out. It could be deleting images of people that are unrelated to law enforcement or not suspected of any illegal activities, but it also relates to assessing access and security of the data storage systems, as well as deciding on how long images should be kept for these law enforcement purposes. So thank you. Yeah, as it's been said before, this is very much an evolving conversation, and these are some suggestions for applying principles. But I'm really keen to hear ideas and experiences from the audience about ways to apply these principles in other sectors or other ways that they've already experimented with successfully or unsuccessfully, for that matter. Thanks.
Thanks, Laure. That was awesome. I have a question to to kick us off, I know this has only been quite recently developed, and I mean, spoiler everyone, I also work for FFI, so I have some involvement here. But I was wondering how you're finding uptake and socialization of these sort of guidelines, and whether you're getting any pushback or any concerns about incorporating. Is this viewed as, how are you overcoming, is this viewed as more paperwork or more oversight that's unnecessary, or is it viewed as something that, oh, this is helpful, and okay, this is a process I can build into my project that's going to have a really good impact? And what's been your experience there?
So I think that would be a really interesting thing to discuss with people on this call, because there's definitely a sentiment that it is a added layer of investigation, data finding, and thinking while preparing projects that are, and that's putting that on people who are already kind of drowning in reporting and trying to keep the timelines and so on and so forth. So that's why we've tried to synthesize the existing literature, but also myself and colleagues are seeing that as much as a kind of reminder for ourselves in conversations that we have with teams that are actually implementing projects. So to kind of not make this additional paperwork, but make this a conversation. So these are in a conversation to make sure that it is included in the paperwork later on. But it doesn't have to be a separate set of paperwork, I think, is our thinking for now on this.
Yeah. You and I have talked about this, but it's quite common. It has a lot in common to our approach at WildLabs for designing events, for example, and making sure we have equal representation of men and women. And it's not like it's a box we tick, though we do track those metrics. It's more of a thought process and a way we approach planning, rather than okay, I need to add this layer of process into my and write this report about it. So I think it's it's really helpful to hear from you about how you're developing guidelines and how you're taking the work that is coming from academia and this really important research that Trishant was sharing and Doug and Chris have been spearheading, and translating that into actually what does that mean for a practitioner who is just trying to work on the front lines and is super stretched. So thank you.
If I can just add, though, a point, building on what Doug mentioned earlier, I think uptake by donors would also provide a bit more of an incentive for practitioners.
In terms of requirements?
In terms of it being required rather than ideal scenario.
Okay, interesting. Talia, did you have a question?
Yes, thanks so much for that presentation. Super interesting, and it's great to learn that FFI is really considering this and building in frameworks for accountability. I was just wondering, are you aware of any other similar efforts by environmental NGOs, or is FFI kind of the leader in this space? Is there opportunity for shared learning from other organizations?
I don't want to claim leadership when I'm not. I think we keep repeating how this is very much an emerging field. And it so happens that there's a few people at FFI who are very sensible to it and informed. I'm sure it's the case in other NGOs, but I guess for now it's not been claimed and publicized. And so I couldn't really tell you how far these debates have progressed inside other large organizations. But maybe people on this call can. We'll find out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, let's pick that up.
Talia,
Oh, sorry, go, Carly.
What are you like? Do you just mean do other organizations have guidelines, or what are you specifically talking about?
I know that WWF in the past year or so has adopted new social and environmental safeguards. And so I know it's something that a lot of other major organizations are considering.
For sure.
But I don't know about whether conservation technologies are specifically considered as part of that. Like I think many organizations, hopefully all organizations, have some kind of safeguards process for working with local communities and indigenous groups. But it's like, are we specifically considering the impacts of conservation tech? Since it seems like a lot of people in the conservation tech world ourselves aren't considering it as much as we should be.
I know from
Okay, yeah.
I know from the just the Wild Labs partnership, it's of consideration for all of the partners in our organization, which is like WWF, WCS, Conservation International, ZSL, FFI. Did I forget someone? No.
No.
But I know FFI, in those conversations, it's been one of the areas that FFI has been really, really conscious about. Just it's partly because of just how they operate, and how closely we work with partners, and a function of that sort of interest. But I think technology is, and safeguarding and the impacts has been a consideration for a really long time, and Laure's work is just the latest iteration of that. Yeah. But it's interesting, NGO world, like there are barriers to sharing processes and sharing documentation and stuff. So much work could be going on that we just don't know about. So there are some barriers there to look at, and some trust to be built, and conversations like this are really, really important for just sharing different ways of doing things. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Thanks, Laure. Koustubh, you're going to go next.